Risen 3 is a semi-open world fantasy pirate-themed action-adventure RPG, and the final game in the Risen trilogy, developed by the small German studio Piranha Bytes in 2014, in which you assemble a crew of allies to sail to various islands trying to reclaim your lost soul after it's taken from you during the introduction, while also finding a way to stop the undead minions of the underworld from taking over the world. Along the way, you explore a variety of different islands, each with their own unique theming, complete various side quests for different factions, and battle enemies with any combination of ranged firearms, melee combat systems, or magic spells. Much like the previous games, you'll join one of 3 factions, which influences your character's overall look and what types of unique abilities you'll have access to, with the Guardians using offensive magic to deal direct damage to enemies in 3 different elements, the Demon Hunters getting various utility buffs to their physical combat skills, and the Voodoo Pirates casting, well, voodoo to manipulate enemies and resurrect dead enemies as allies, among other things. The game takes place over 4 chapters of storytelling in a completely non-linear structure where, after completing the very first island, which acts as sort of a tutorial, you're free to travel any of the world's 6 islands, or 8 total if you have the DLC, plus 1 extra that unlocks near the end of the main quest, and work towards any or all of its main quests in whatever order you like. When I played Risen 3 originally, back when it first launched, I rather enjoyed it. At the time, it felt like the most complete, polished game that Piranha Bytes had made in over a decade, and considering all the mechanical improvements they made to the gameplay from Risen 2, which they largely copied over to serve as the foundation for Risen 3, it made Risen 3 an immediately much more enjoyable and less frustrating experience than its direct predecessor. There were also several overt steps taken this time around to try to go back to their roots, as they prominently declared in their pre-release marketing campaigns, which helped to lend it a little bit more of an authentic Piranha Bytes feel. Still, it had some major problems that I pointed out at the time, dealing mainly with its underwhelming plot, ridiculously easy difficulty, and the extreme front-loading of its content, with a chapter progression that never really escalated towards the finale. Besides that, it also just felt a little too derivative of Risen 2 to really stand on its own legs, with my ultimate conclusion being that it felt more like Risen 2.5 than an actual Risen 3. Coming back to it now, 10 years later, I find that most of my critical assessments remain the same as they were originally. However, it's made me appreciate various aspects of the previous 2 Risen games more in retrospect, while some of its more tedious design elements seem to have worn on my patience more than they did originally. Tedious is probably the key word in my current assessment of Risen 3. So much of it feels like an uninspired, by-the-books attempt at recapturing the Piranha Bytes formula without many new, original ideas to embellish on the experience. A lot of it, therefore, winds up feeling like a pale shadow of the same things we've already seen and done before, with a somewhat formulaic approach taken to churn out content to make the game feel bigger and longer than the previous 2, which can make it all feel just a bit tedious. Although it's technically pretty competent, and it certainly provided me with a much more enjoyable experience overall than Risen 2, I just found myself feeling bored a lot of the time because there's not much interesting excitement and hardly anything the game has to offer. Getting into Risen 3 can be pretty jarring in the first place, since it offers next to zero exposition for anything. Unlike the previous 2 Risen games, there's no narrative framing to establish the context of the series to this point, or any of the background lore, or what the game's actual premise is going to be about. When you click New Game, it just immediately jumps into a poorly constructed cutscene where characters start talking immediately on top of every cut as soon as you click New Game and as soon as the perspective shifts to a new character, the apparent ghost of Captain Crow, whom you defeated in the previous game, with zero establishing shots to allow either of these shots to breathe, or for the impact of Crow being back from the dead to settle in, or just for the sequence to flow more naturally. It feels objectively wrong from the very first second, and it's just really clunky and awkward to sit through. Then it turns into a ham-fisted tutorial that's been shoehorned into an exciting action scene where you don't know anything about what's going on and have no reason to care about anything. That by itself isn't so much of a problem. Stories are sometimes more exciting when they start in the middle of something and then allow you to catch up later. But then you wake up and realize it was all a dream and you're now in a completely different situation, which the game then doesn't establish either. You're just suddenly on an island with a vague pretense of searching for the greatest treasure of the southern seas, whatever that is, where nothing you saw in the dream sequence is going to impact the story down the line. I guess the concept of staring death in the face is foreshadowing the fact that your character is going to die soon, but that's basically it. Although, you will fight the ghost of Captain Crow and the giant sea monster he summons later on. In fact, you'll replay that exact same dream sequence in full near the very end, complete with the exact same cutscene pausing tutorials because they were too lazy to change even that. But neither of these is really important to the story apart from being things to do on the checklist of the main quest. Crow himself is just a red herring who disappears off screen for the entire game until it's time to fight him at the very end, and the sea monster is just a random combat encounter who's not treated as any kind of threat in the world that must be stopped. Meanwhile, on this new island, there's no exposition for who you are, what your relationship with Patty is, what the treasure you're looking for actually is, why you're looking for that treasure, how you came to be in this situation, how things have changed in the world since Risen 2, or anything like that. For the rest of the island, you're just going through another, much lengthier tutorial sequence where Patty explains basic gameplay concepts to you. This part is actually pretty decent, apart from Patty constantly nagging you to stick to the path.
According to the map, we need to follow the path. Where are you wandering off to? We've got to stay on the path. We've gone too far. We need to turn back. Do you even know where we are? I don't think this is the right place. Stay on the path. We need to follow the path.
If you actually follow the path, the level design has a good structure to it with good pacing between the different encounters, and it does a good job of introducing you to a fair amount of variety in terms of what types of enemies you'll encounter in the game and the different types of activities you can get into. So it's not a bad teaser to start the game with. The problem is, it can last up to an hour, maybe up to 2 hours depending on how much of the island you explore, which is potentially 2 hours of running around in the game with no idea what the plot is actually supposed to be about and no narrative hook to catch your interest. Then, at the end, you're suddenly attacked by demonic hellhounds who emerge from a portal to the underworld, and a skeletal apparition appears and kills you, only for you to be resurrected 3 weeks later by Bones, who returns from Risen 2, at which point you finally get some semblance of a plot dumped on you, when it's finally revealed that your primary goal in the game is to find a spiritual leader who can help you reclaim your lost soul. It's not really clear why this is such a big deal, however. Your body has already been brought back to life, and you seem to be functioning completely normally, almost as if you hadn't died at all. Your stats are lower than they were before, so I guess you've been weakened a little bit, but the game's an RPG and you're going to have opportunities to level up and regain all of your lost strength and then some through the gameplay mechanics, so the narrative pretense about why you even need to recover your lost soul is contradicted by the actual gameplay mechanics. Bones gives some spiel about your soul wavering in the underworld and how you run the risk of turning into a demon or something, which is seemingly alluding to the game's role-playing karma meter meant to reflect your humanity based on your dialogue choices, but this risk is pretty vague and unsubstantiated. In fact, nothing of that sort ever plays into the equation throughout the actual gameplay, as your soul rating doesn't reflect any actual changes to your character or humanity. It mostly just determines whether a few companion characters will stick around or not. So in practice, the main quest to recover your lost soul doesn't have any real weight to it, and offered me little motivation for why I should care about the main quest despite its alleged importance. There's also a suggestion after you're resurrected to visit Admiral Alvarez of the Pirate Council on Antigua, another character who's returned from Risen 2, to report on your status or something. This goes on to explain the greater threat facing the world, with Crow and his ghost fleet sailing the southern seas and minions of the underworld appearing everywhere, thus threatening to destroy the world as we know it and giving you a whole bevy of tasks you need to work on to prevent them from succeeding. This at least presents some idea of stakes and consequences for the main plot, but you're given complete non-linear freedom to go to any island to focus on any of the various tasks that Bones has given you after your resurrection, which might seem like they're more important, like working towards getting your soul back or reuniting with Patty. And so it's possible you might not go to Antigua for who knows how long, and thus might not get this next important bit of establishing context for the game's central conflict until much, much later in the game. Meanwhile, it turns out you are actually playing a different protagonist from the first two games, this time the son of Captain Steelbeard and half-brother to Patty, who's now the most consistent character throughout the series, which is ironic given how much she's changed from game to game. In reality, the new protagonist may as well be the same character as before, because the main character doesn't really matter much in these games, and they didn't do much to differentiate him from the previous character apart from Patty running around suddenly calling you little brother the whole time.
Oh, why do you always have to touch everything, little brother?
He even shares the same identical trait as the previous character of having no name that we know of, but with this supposedly being a brand new character with a specific background, pre-existing relationships with certain people, and legacy expectations to uphold, he doesn't need to be nameless as well, since that just confuses matters between the two of them and makes him seem like a phony substitute for the real thing. If he had to be a different character, then it would have made more sense to me to give him a proper name and flesh out his personality and backstory a little more so that he can actually feel like a different character. The actor's vocal delivery is certainly different, arguably for the worse, as it may be enough to turn some people off from the game entirely due to how forcibly raspy and gruff he's trying to sound.
Have I got this right? A total stranger trying to steal treasure from the nastiest bastards on the southern seas and on their own island? What the fuck?
Yes, but...
Do us both a favor and forget your plan. It's
This unpleasant tone, combined with substandard writing for his personality, leaves him feeling bereft of the charm and charisma that the main character had in the previous games, especially the second one, where he came off as a sarcastically plucky rogue you wanted to root for. But here he seems a little more like a generic sailor thug who curses a lot. You get used to it, and it does grow on you after a while, but it can be pretty off-putting at first. I've read that the original German voice actor who played the lead in the first 2 games was dealing with serious health problems and couldn't record for the 3rd game, and maybe even died shortly after the 3rd game released. If that's true, then it would explain the decision to change characters, especially if they were trying to honor him by not just recasting the role, but I think for the sake of the story it would just work better if we were playing the same character as before, who had established relationships with all of the old characters that we could then build off of. There was a lot of subtle character development between the nameless hero and Patty in the previous games, for instance, with them starting out as strangers in Risen 1 and developing a sort of endearing camaraderie by the end of that game, and then meeting back up in Risen 2 and developing coy hints of possible romantic feelings, all of which is completely gone in Risen 3 because you're now a different character altogether. And by being her brother and already on good terms with her from the start of the game, that means there's nowhere to really grow with that relationship. It's a narrative dead end, and in fact, it's a completely optional story branch since you can go the whole game without ever recruiting Patty back into your crew. That's a weird creative decision all on its own, seeing as she's been the player's #1 ally throughout the previous 2 games, and now all of a sudden she's been demoted to an optional side character despite being your sister this time around, with Bones of all people now being your right-hand man in every cutscene. Tons of other characters are back from Risen 2, and there are even a few important characters from Risen 1 as well, but you don't really get to appreciate them as returning characters because they're effectively all new characters as far as the protagonist is concerned. Even for the player, some of them have been changed to the point of not looking or sounding like they did originally. Patty is the most obvious example of this with her new hat, but there are a few others that have mysteriously been given a different voice actor despite having the same voice actor back to play other roles in the game.
Well, at least I've been here a while, but you look like you've just arrived. What did you do to end up haunting this place?
A grasping, greedy snake of a man, but a fine captain. Always one step ahead of his opponents. Always finishes everything he starts. A dangerous man to cross. All right. Thanks. I will return the favor. Just don't tell him I've been on a thieving spree on Tacarigua. He's already... well, you'll find out when you talk to him.
Mendoza, in particular, has had his whole personality changed, with him now being portrayed as a low-down, vile, despicable a-hole who's basically evil just for the sake of being evil, when in Risen 1 he was seemingly a good guy with good intentions. It's just that his ends justify the means method of trying to save the world was at odds with the island's survival and posed too great a risk as to whether it would even work at all, hence why you had to fight him at the end. There was a random line in Risen 2 about the ocular being cursed and somehow changing the people who wear it, but Mendoza seemed pretty normal at the end of Risen 1, so I don't really buy the change now that he's dead and free of the ocular, unless he was an evil a-hole all along and it was the ocular that changed him into a rational humanitarian. But that doesn't make much sense to me either. So while it may be hard for the player to actually recognize some of these returning characters, I'm not sure the characters themselves even recognize each other, since people like Patty, Bones, and Jafar are present in both games and had previously worked together to help save the world from Mara in Risen 2, and yet they never seem to acknowledge this fact in Risen 3. Everyone exists in a vacuum of sorts where they basically only interact with the player when they really should have dynamic dialogue triggers where they recognize each other and say something if you have one in your party when you first meet another, or when they're all together on the ship for the first time. Perhaps this was done to avoid alienating players who hadn't played the previous game, but I think they could have easily satisfied old and new audiences alike by just having your character ask, "Sorry, you two know each other?" and then have them make a quick comment about something that happened in Risen 2. The companions do an okay job of commenting on other things in the environment, usually having something to say about each major location and many general areas of the game, even sometimes interjecting during dialogue.
My father would have had you keel-hauled for such a reward.
Fine. Here. I'll throw in some extra.
But then again, there are plenty of other times when it seems like they really should have something to say, but then don't. Like when you finally catch up to Slim, the guy who sold you the map that got you killed. Patty should be absolutely pissed at this dude, and yet if you have her with you, she just stands there in complete silence. Or, say, when you encounter a random gnome in the middle of Keela and have Jafar with you. You'd think he might have something novel to say about another gnome in that situation, but again, he just stands there in complete silence. Beyond that, there's a lack of varied vocal talent in general, with you hearing a lot of the same voice actors doing the exact same voices for different characters on every island, sometimes even in the same location.
You're the guy they are all talking about around here, aren't you?
Are they?
Yes. They say you have what it takes. So you know all about the gnomes, don't you? You're not gonna just saunter in here, are you?
And what if I am?
No way. General Magnus doesn't want anyone to disturb the mages.
William Roberts has one of the most recognizable voices among the entire cast due to his previous roles as Diego in Gothic 1 and Vesemir in the Witcher games, and so it sticks out like a sore thumb when you hear his voice in one character near the entrance to the Guardians camp on Tyrannus, and then again in another character just a short walk away on the other side of the camp. Now to be fair, repeated voice actors happens all the time in these kinds of games, but in this case it's not just noticeable, but it's actively distracting, which is a much bigger issue. The actual story of Risen 3 is yet another departure from the established premise of the Risen series, albeit not nearly as extreme as it was in Risen 2. You would think that, with the game being officially subtitled as Titan Lords, it would continue the plot thread from Risen 2 of warring Titan Lords like Ursagor and Ismail needing to be stopped to save the world from total destruction. But instead, the story forgets about that whole concept, which is just left hanging unresolved in the previous game, in favor of introducing a new bad guy with unrelated motivations as the grand finale to this trilogy. The main bad guy controlling these minions is supposed to be a Titan Lord, and you do indeed fight the so-called Titan of Death at the very end, but they don't really feel like Titans or Titan Lords according to how the series lore was established in the first game, or how it was retconned in the second one. The concept is further muddied by how the supposed Titan Lord transforms into the supposed Titan, or reveals his true form to be the Titan of Death. So by this point in the series, the rules of what constitutes a Titan or Titan Lord have been seemingly thrown out the window, if there ever were any rules to begin with, as there's been no real consistency in how this series' lore is actually depicted. Necroloth is effectively an unrelated villain with his own personal agenda who's merely had the title Titan Lord arbitrarily tacked on in a loose attempt to tie him in with the other games in the series. It makes the whole series feel underwhelming and anticlimactic, since nothing that either of the first two games established was followed through in subsequent games, with the third game not resolving anything at all. I'm about to spoil the ending and the game's most notable twist here, but frankly, the story in this game does not matter, and the ending is so practically non-existent that I don't consider this to be a real spoiler. But just in case anyone actually cares, you may want to consider skipping ahead a little bit. The whole point of Risen 3 is to recover your lost soul and defeat Necroloth, which you accomplish at the very end of the game, and then the story doesn't really end. It just stops. The ending cutscene is just 30 seconds of your character walking out of the final boss encounter, stopping to look at your group of companions who were apparently just hanging around chatting the whole time while you were busy saving the world all by yourself, and then it cuts right to your ship leaving, followed by the credits. That's what you get for a neutral soul alignment, but you can potentially see a tiny bit of extra content in the ending with a sufficiently high or low enough soul rating. With the good ending, you'll see an additional short image of Patty running up to hug you, and with the bad ending, you'll see an additional short image of your character ominously turning to the camera like he's become a dark spirit of the underworld. And that's it. A meager 5 seconds of extra footage with only the briefest tease of extra implications to the game's resolution. There is zero follow-up to what defeating Necroloth actually means for the fate of the world and the rest of humanity, or what's going to happen with your character or any of your other crew members next, and there's no resolution to any of the lingering plot threads from Risen 1 or 2 about the remaining Titans or other Titan Lords. This cutscene is even more awkward, by the way, if you were sparse on recruiting party members, because everyone just gets replaced with the generic crew members that you don't know or care about, making it even more anticlimactic. As for the twist, it's revealed that your plan to gather spiritual leaders to conduct a magic ritual to retrieve your soul from the underworld was actually a trap set by Necroloth to bring his spirit into the real world while also capturing the 3 most powerful mages, whose power he was going to use to do something. I guess to help him manifest the Titan and then defend his fortress in the process? I find this twist pretty frustrating, because Necroloth himself was poorly established in the story until this point. He was practically non-existent, as he was only briefly teased in 2 random cutaways where he's basically just off on his own metaphorically twirling his mustache. So having the big bad guy pull one over on you, especially so late in the game, is not very dramatic when you don't even know at that point who the bad guy even is or why you should care. It's nowhere near as dramatic as a trick Garcia pulls on you in Risen 2, which had you interacting with Garcia more directly before the twist and with more foreshadowing to set it up. Necroloth also indicates that every step of your adventure, from the very moment you died on the Crab Coast, perhaps even before that, and getting you there in the first place and planting a fake spell that you would eventually find, believing it would help recover your lost soul, was part of his grand scheme. I find this extremely contrived and borderline nonsensical, given just how many steps it involves between so many different characters and so many different locations, with first getting you to the correct island so you can die, then just assuming someone will come along to resurrect your body, and hoping that you'll be able to figure out how to recover your lost soul, and that your own independently thought up plan will also involve bringing the 3 most powerful mages together, and that one of them will suggest finding a particular spell that Necroloth has already modified in secret, and that you'll actually find the fake spell in question, while also anticipating that this would happen in Margoloth's lair and having a plan to bypass her shield, or just getting lucky about the spell being cast from inside Margoloth's shield where it wouldn't be affected, and also that you'll run into his accomplice Horus and let him into your crew so that he can betray you later. It seems like this plan would need so many things to go perfectly right for it to work while being needlessly convoluted in the first place. If Horus was working for him all along, then why does he not make Horus play a more active role in guiding you through his plan? Apparently you and Patty were on the Crab Coast searching for treasure based on a map you got from some guy named Slim, but when you confront Slim, he makes no mention of having been in cahoots with or deceived by anyone else. So was his involvement in all of this just a complete coincidence? Why not just have Horus be the guy who gives you the map and insist on sailing with you so that he can be there when you die, and then act like him going out of his way to help you recover your soul is part of making amends for your death? And why even hide the spell in such a remote location that takes so much effort for you to find? Why not just give Horus the spell and have him tell you what you need to do to cast the spell so you can just skip all the extra steps and just get right to preparing the ritual? Was all of this extra obfuscation just to minimize your chances of suspecting anything nefarious was going on? And what was Crow's role in this plan? Was he specifically luring you to the Skull Portal on the Crab Coast? Why would that be necessary when you already had a treasure map taking you to that exact spot? Again, is it just coincidence that both Crow and Slim are seemingly pointing you in that direction, or was this extra insurance by Necroloth to ensure you'll actually get there? And is there any significance in why you were chosen for this, or was it just random coincidence and bad luck on your part? Is Crow supposed to be getting your body as a way to restore his spirit or something? And if so, why don't they do anything with your body during the 3 weeks that you're lying there buried on the Crab Coast? Why does Necroloth need this elaborate plan to bring his own spirit into the world when he was already able to bring Crow's spirit back and create portals that other minions could just come out from? Basically, the whole plot makes no sense to me, and there's seemingly little effort given by the game to explain any of these details. I would hope that there's some logic to everything that I'm just not seeing, but it really seems like there was no real thought given to any of this, because the only answer I can come up with for any of my questions is because the game needs to happen, or just because. That's disappointing in and of itself, but it's even more so considering that the storytelling in Risen 2 is head and shoulders above what they did with Risen 3, with that game doing a much better job of establishing the context of the story, getting you into its central premise more quickly, and providing you with much more engaging narrative arcs and characters along the way to its finale, which actually provides some semblance of a resolution to the game. Many things in Risen 3 are a direct improvement over Risen 2, but the storytelling is one area where they actually went backwards. The main quest and all of the world's exploration is intended for everything to be doable in a non-linear order, with you gaining access to every single island and practically every main quest objective as soon as you complete the introduction sequence on the Crab Coast. Although I would normally advocate for more open world freedom in a game like this, the decision to move away from the slightly more linear progression of islands like was done in Risen 2, where you first had to do a prologue on Caldera and then complete all or most of Tacarigua and then the Sword Coast before the rest of the map opened up for non-linear questing, in favor of having everything unlocked basically right from the start, actually has a major consequence on both the narrative pacing of the main quest as well as the game's balancing and difficulty progression, especially in conjunction with the way the main quest is executed. There's no strong narrative thrust to any of the main quests at the start of the game, or for most of the game for that matter, since most of it is basically just a checklist of tasks that you need to complete, and all of the main umbrella quests to defeat X amount of Shadow Lords, close X amount of crystal portals, and recruit X amount of allied ships, which requires that you do X amount of quests for each faction, which is also part of gaining each faction leader's trust so they'll participate in the ritual to help recover your lost soul, before anything of note happens in the story at the start of Chapter 4, the final chapter of the game. Good storytelling typically involves rising stakes as the story progresses towards the climax, but you spend most of the game with decreasing stakes since the start of the game presents you with seemingly every possible threat in the world, and then you progressively clear every enemy and every source of their existence from the map in what is effectively the first act of the story. These tasks aren't given much narrative framing of their own either, like was done for obtaining each of the 4 Titan artifacts from the 4 pirate captains in Risen 2, where every one of those tasks felt like its own dedicated chapter in the story, complete with a full story structure of exposition, rising action, conflict, climax, and resolution. In Risen 3, these objectives don't feel like they're actually part of a story that's being told. They're just incidental tasks that have been peppered around the map to give the player things to do in the main questline and to pad out its runtime. With every quest and every island being doable in any order, it means that most quests and most enemies on every island have to be designed so they're doable at any stage of your playthrough, with every island having the same types of enemies placed around it in a similar type of progressive layout. Because the game doesn't know which island you'll go to first, every enemy around where you first land on each island has to be easy enough for a level 1 player to beat, and then they all have to radiate out into stronger versions the farther you get away from the starting beach, with the island's toughest enemies usually contained within the Shadowlands where the minions of the underworld have taken over. I would guess the intention was for the Shadowlands to be more of a mid-game obstacle that you're meant to avoid and come back to later once you're stronger, but the reality is they're actually relatively easy to clear out, even with zero combat training whatsoever while playing on the hardest difficulty. So in practical terms, you'll be able to defeat every single enemy on the first island you visit, and then once you clear your first island, you'll be in for the exact same difficulty progression on every subsequent island you visit, with each one getting progressively easier because of all the experience and combat training you've gained from the previous ones. That feeling of getting stronger and having an easier time defeating enemies that used to be difficult is ordinarily something I would praise in a Piranha Bytes game, but the effect is lost here when everything is so easy to begin with that you don't really need to get stronger to defeat the toughest enemies the underworld is ever going to throw at you. And then going through the same progression of tiered enemy difficulties on every single island without any sort of escalating difficulty by virtue of never introducing newer, tougher enemies to the mix gets to feel incredibly tedious and repetitive. At least they didn't resort to level scaling enemy stats to ramp the difficulty up on later islands, but I think they could have easily achieved the same effect with a Gothic 2 approach done in the style they established with Risen 2, which would have allowed them to maintain a more consistently challenging difficulty curve while also giving the story more opportunities to influence the gameplay in fun and exciting ways. It would just involve having you visit islands in a more specific order with occasional chances to branch out in different directions of your choosing, and then have later main quest events cause new changes and effects on previously explored islands that change the state of the island with altered areas and new enemies to fight, and even new side quests that arise as a result of these dramatic changes. Basically, I just think the game would be better if they'd spread the content out more evenly across the total playtime instead of front-loading everything in what is effectively the first chapter of the game, and allowed for more dynamic quest opportunities where the world could feel like it's actually changing as a result of advancing the main quest, with rising stakes towards the climax and progressively tougher enemies to fight as you level up. And yet, despite their apparent zeal for complete upfront non-linearity, it doesn't really work as a fully non-linear experience because so many things secretly do need to be done in a certain order, while other quest lines, dialogue, and events can completely break down if you do them out of the intended order. For instance, I decided that my first objective after being resurrected would be to reunite with Patty, so I went to Tacarigua where she was said to be looking for the guy that sold us the treasure map. I went there and was promptly told that my princess was in another castle and that I should look for her on Keela. So I went to Keela, where I found her, and then she told me she wouldn't join up because I didn't have a big enough boat, even though I tried to convince her it's not the size of the boat that matters, it's the motion of the ocean. Regardless, I then had to join a faction to get a bigger boat, which meant going to Tyrannus and doing all of their membership quests, and then when they were ready to accept me, my character said I needed to report to Alvarez before I could join. So then I went to Antigua and had to resolve a bunch of problems around there for Alvarez before I could finally join a faction, so I could finally get a ship, so I could finally join back up with Patty. In the process of doing quests to join the Guardians on Tyrannus, I wound up completely breaking the questline on Tacarigua by apparently finding and rescuing Horus before talking with any of the Inquisition folks around town, which caused all of the main quests in Puerto Sacarico to get cancelled before I even knew they existed, so I never got to see any of the central conflict or story of Tacarigua. It then made the vengeful confrontation from Sebastiano later on during a random sea battle feel completely hollow and meaningless when I had had zero interaction with him previously. I also may have somehow missed some aspect of Edward's questline when he just randomly showed up as a fully fledged member of the Demon Hunter faction during the quest where Eldrick is mounting a task force to cross the impassable lava stream. Before that, he'd just been a regular-ass dude on my ship making vague comments about having a weird feeling that something dark and sinister was going on.
Because we have newcomers in our midst who have brought us hope. Look at them. Proud men, full of strength and drive.
Then at other times, main quest dialogue doesn't line up or make sense, like how I managed to convince all 3 faction leaders to join me for the spirit ritual before locating a proper ritual site, and then had no way and no opportunity to tell them where to actually go to perform the ritual, so I guess they just psychically knew what was going on, or else Eldrick sent a carrier pigeon off screen or something. Even just trying to focus on a particular main quest can be a struggle because of progress being arbitrarily blocked behind other hidden factors and dialogue trees. Some quests can be started in Chapter 2 but can't be completed until Chapter 3, or else seem like a faction-related side quest but are secretly a main quest that won't be relevant until later, which then come to an awkward halt with no clear indication of how to advance the quest any further. Sometimes you can pick up later stages of a quest which end up being sub-stages of another quest entry that you haven't unlocked yet, which end up feeling like inexplicable dead ends because you don't have the surrounding context for the quest active yet to know what it's supposed to be a part of or what to do next. Other times you might be going through dialogue options with a major NPC about a particular subject that suggests something about a particular course of action you need to take, which then disappears from the list of follow-up dialogue options with no immediate option to continue that line of the conversation until you have exhausted all the other unrelated prompts for other tasks you maybe weren't looking to get involved with yet, before you can get back on course with the topic you were originally trying to focus on. So just in general, the main quest feels lacking in momentum, where things will often come to a halt, leaving you with no real option but to awkwardly shift gears and work on other tasks in the meantime until some seemingly unrelated task will eventually unlock progress in something else. The one interesting thing about the main quest is occasional moments when you're attacked at sea, when sailing from one island to another. This can take the form of either monster attacks where you steer your ship around trying to line up broadside cannons for clear shots while avoiding the monster's attacks, or ship-to-ship battles where you fight off boarding attackers while trying to clear their explosives from your ship and shooting down the other ship's crew with your deck cannons. These are unlike anything that's ever been done in a Piranha Bytes game before, so they're exciting just for that reason alone, and it's nice how they make your ship actually part of the gameplay now as opposed to only being featured in the transitional cutscene when fast traveling from island to island. The sea creature fight controls reasonably well for being such a large vessel, and I appreciate the effort given to make your ship actually bob up and down on the waves, but the fights themselves are simple and repetitive, since you do essentially the same fight 3 different times except it just gets slightly harder each time. It also seems like there's a fair amount of random luck in terms of whether the monster will spawn close enough in a good enough position for you to be able to actually get close enough to fire your broadside cannons on it before it submerges again, which can make the fights feel unnecessarily drawn out and tedious. The ship-to-ship battles are less unique given that they're mere adaptations of existing mechanics, with the only real twist being the cover system when using the deck cannons. The cannons themselves have a weird trajectory that seems to go above the targeting reticle, so it's a bit of a hassle trying to line up a shot, especially with the waves and the constant explosions shaking the screen. While I appreciate the inclusion of these sea battles as one of the few truly unique and exciting additions to the formula, the actual gameplay mechanics are somewhat crude and feel like more of a rough draft of something that should have been in Risen 2 from the start before being fleshed out more properly in Risen 3. In a change from previous Piranha Bytes games, the faction quests can now be done regardless of whether you've already joined another faction. This is a nice change because it was frankly kind of tedious feeling obligated in some of the previous Gothic and Risen games to have to do all faction quests before picking one, but I wish they would have done a better job communicating this option to the player more effectively. In my case, when Risen 3 first launched, I treated it like I would any other Piranha Bytes game by doing all faction quests before joining one, which meant in this case that I had done like 75% or more of the game's total content without the benefit of faction armor or abilities. Needless to say, that made much of the game more difficult than it needed to be, and also meant that I just missed out on all the fun gameplay altering abilities for that much of my total playtime. That's really more of a personal problem than a game problem, but replaying it now and knowing in advance that I could join a faction whenever I want made for a more satisfying gameplay experience. Now of course, you still miss out on the rank promotion quests and other quests necessary to unlock new abilities, so there's still some replay value to be had with joining another faction in a second or third playthrough. The faction quests and other side quests likewise do a serviceable job of providing unique narrative context for their situations, with each one being specifically tailored for each island and offering some decent character interaction along the way. Sometimes they'll even give you options for how to solve them based on what skills you've trained or what personal role-playing options you might prefer. The quest to retrieve 4 bags of crystals for Frink on Tyrannus, for instance, is just a completely simple fetch quest where you go into the mines right behind him and wander around until you find 4 bags of crystals. But you get interesting interactions with possible role-playing options and him spouting off about the rules and Geralt's neglected responsibility and then randomly quizzing you to see if you were paying attention. And then there's extra involvement with Geralt where you can help him to continue slacking off or report him to Frink to get him in trouble, which can possibly come into play later on when it comes time to deliver a prism to Geralt for another quest. Stuff like that helps to ensure that the quests meet at least a baseline level of satisfying engagement, despite their mechanics rarely being all that sophisticated, but unfortunately, they don't really aspire to be much more than baseline, and so the majority of them wind up feeling pretty tedious in the grand scheme of things. In truth, the quest design is probably on par with how things were executed in Risen 2, which I likewise found decently satisfying if not especially impressive in that game, but it seems like there are more total quests in Risen 3 spread out over a much larger map. Consequently, a higher portion of quests in this game do feel like legitimate filler content, even if the presentation is a little better than your typically shallow MMO-style kill quests and fetch quests. That can dilute the overall quality of the quest and give more opportunity for those simpler, lesser developed quests to add up over time and become more noticeable, if not just straight up repetitive. It's hard, for example, to feel satisfied with a quest when the premise is to find a way to stop the distracting noises happening outside someone's hut, only for the solution to be literally walking around the corner and killing an innocent armadillo, a process that takes maybe 5 seconds to resolve. In my case, I enjoyed doing quests on the first island, which for me was Tyrannus, since it was early in my playthrough and I was eager to get into the gameplay and more willing to play along with its sometimes flimsy pretenses for why I was doing some of these quests. But by the time I got to Calidor and then eventually Keela, my patience was starting to wear out, with all the quests starting to feel like yet another checklist of things to do on each island that I was only doing for the sake of completionism. The starting quests on Calidor are exemplary of what I mean, with it having a lot of generally uninspired quest design. You arrive on the beach and immediately get an escort quest from a guy to go to a fishing village literally right next to the beach, within throwing distance, to the point that he could just casually point and say, "Yeah, it's right there, just walk over and introduce yourself," without needing to make a full quest out of it. Then you get a quest to clear the beach of dangerous creatures who are right next to the village so that the fishermen can get back to work, with the option to choose money or raw fish as your reward. Another character interaction in that village leads to a knife-throwing mini-game, which is more of a punishment than a reward as far as I'm concerned. Then you run into a guardian who's been sent by the mages to collect special crystals as part of another quest you may have already been tasked with, and he just gives you the crystals with the opportunity to shift your soul rating based on your dialogue choice. Then you encounter a butcher at a pig farm who gives you the chance to buy provisions, which are completely worthless, through an actual quest entry, which again seemingly didn't need to be an actual quest. Then you run into a sorcerer who has a woman bound up in magic restraints, who just comes out and tells you he was going to sacrifice her and then launches right into combat with you, and then the woman just gets let down and goes right back to the tavern with no further elaboration from either of these two characters. These quests all task you with the same types of simplistic gameplay scenarios you've likely already experienced for however many dozens of hours until that point, and they're all completely straightforward, one-step affairs with no extra complications, done up with just a little bit of unique dialogue to set the context for everything. If this were the first island I'd have visited, maybe it wouldn't have felt so tedious, but by that point, having already done all of Tyrannus and all of Antigua and part of Tacarigua, there was no excitement left for me to experience in those quests, as it felt like legitimate busy work. Exploration eventually falls into that same rut, despite being much improved from Risen 2. The islands are much more visually interesting this time around, with each one having its own distinct style to lend it a more unique atmosphere, so thankfully it doesn't feel like you're always running around similar environments the whole game like was often the case in Risen 2. And of course the actual world design is about what you would expect from Piranha Bytes, with utilizing varied topographies and more intricate spatial relationships between areas to make them feel more dense than they actually are, and thus more actively engaging to navigate and explore. It also does a much better job than Risen 2 of putting loot in hidden areas, thus incentivizing you to check around every corner or on top of every building. The loot itself is also more rewarding due to there being more practical things to find, like spell scrolls and rare plants that you can use to craft permanent attribute potions, both of which were essentially absent in Risen 2, but also because you now have to find and use teleporter stones before you can activate the fast travel points. The newly reinstated climbing system allows a little more freeform use of the climbing animations and higher jumps, in conjunction with the return of the levitate spell from Risen 1 in the form of parrot transformation scrolls to reach higher vantage points without always needing to rely on those highly telegraphed stair-step looking ledges. And you can now once again swim, which again was inexplicably absent in Risen 2, so you can actually explore more diverse areas of the map that sometimes feel like you may even be veering outside of the intended play area instead of being constantly railroaded into following the intended paths and never thinking outside the box. Unfortunately, the game still has an annoying tendency to railroad you with invisible walls in random places that prevent you from exploring in areas where it seems like there might be some hidden loot, or to prevent you from taking a route to a particular location that they did not intend. The most obnoxious example of this happens on Calidor, when the other side of the island across the lava river is supposed to be restricted until Chapter 3 and require an elaborate quest from Eldrick to cross via some kind of magical manipulation of the teleporter network, even though it would be incredibly easy to just fly across and activate the teleporter on the other side with a parrot spell. Hell, you could even just swim to the beach on the other side, and yet the game forcibly restricts you from taking either of these routes. For as egregious as that is, I can put up with it due to it being part of a major quest and thus seemingly more of an exception, but it happens all the time on a much smaller scale in all kinds of other random areas, where you either can't climb a ledge that looks like it should be easily climbable, or run into more invisible walls. Keela, for instance, has a pretty neat Easter egg that you can find by climbing on one of its mountains into a seemingly out-of-bounds area, and then teases you with possibly being able to get on top of the Great Wall, which you would think would be prime real estate to put some kind of special loot, but then you're blasted with even more invisible walls. It's frustrating how inconsistently the invisible walls are applied, because it feels like the game is encouraging you to explore every little nook and cranny and then randomly restricts you from doing so. There's still a baseline level of satisfaction to be had from exploring the environment, because it does still fundamentally feel like a Piranha Bytes game with their signature world design and atmosphere. On an individual level, everything is at least technically decent, maybe even good or great sometimes, but I find that in the context of the full game, exploration in Risen 3 just becomes tiring after a while. Once you realize that you're just going through the same motions on every island, fighting many of the exact same enemies and looting mostly the same items just in a slightly different configuration over and over and over again. It's dreadfully tedious, for instance, landing on a new island where you'll be fighting sand devils and giant crabs and looting clams on the beach like you've already done 3, 4, or 5 times previously, with still more beaches elsewhere on the island yet to explore, where you'll fight even more sand devils and giant crabs and loot even more clams. I'd be curious to know how many clams I actually picked up in my playthrough, because it might be well over 1,000, which needless to say is excessive and not very fun gameplay to be so heavily involved with. You're also given a map for every island as soon as you arrive, complete with an all-new, un-Piranha Bytes-like mini-map that's turned on by default, which telegraphs the island's entire layout, including all of its pathways, dead ends, and cave entrances in precise detail right from the start, before you've had a chance to discover any of this stuff for yourself. This allows you to plan a sequential route through the map where you're able to clear each area in full before moving on to the next one, which I find further contributes to the game's tedious checklist feeling, because the exploration is potentially more about just crossing areas off the map screen than it is about actually exploring the map and finding stuff with your own eyes. Thankfully, there are hidden areas and features that the maps don't specifically spoil for you, so there is some genuine feeling of rewarding discovery in searching the maps for yourself, but I find myself really missing the old style of map design from the early Gothic games, where they gave you hand-drawn approximations of the map that allowed you to see where you were in the world and where different areas were without revealing every little detail. One thing Risen 3 copies from Gothic 2 is bringing back old maps from the previous game and doing them up in a slightly different aesthetic, but the execution in Risen 3 is nowhere near as good. A big part of it is simply the fact that the maps from Risen 2 are not nearly as memorable or nostalgic as the map from Gothic 1, so getting the chance to return to Tacarigua, Antigua, and Thieves' Isle is already predisposed to being a less exciting prospect. But then once you're on those islands, the main areas don't feel like they've changed all that much. Antigua, for instance, is basically the same except for some of the furniture being knocked over when you first arrive, which then gets put back in place after you clear the hellhounds from the area. The only notable change is that the upper floor of the warehouse burned down. Some areas of these old maps have changed to look like Shadowlands from the underworld, but this visual style is comparatively bland and nowhere near as interesting as the more dramatic and more thematic changes made to the different areas of Gothic 2, where each dragon brought its own unique style to the area for increased variety. So you lose out on that fun feeling Gothic 2 had of seeing how much the colony had changed from one game to the next and getting to feel the joy of discovering a familiar place for the first time all over again. This is a prime example of their by-the-books attempt at recapturing their old formula, and taking clear inspiration from their previous and arguably much better games while only implementing the basic, surface-level concepts and not any of the deeper aspects that made those elements good in the first place. Exploration in Risen 3 is technically always rewarding because every bit of glory you gain from defeated enemies contributes to your progression, and the skills you have to learn from trainers have steep gold costs to pay for, but most of the individual rewards you find aren't all that valuable. This includes loot that you find in locked chests as well, so it takes larger quantities of loot and thus longer amounts of time collecting that loot before you accumulate enough stuff for it all to feel worth it. Depending on how lucky you are, you may not even be able to find worthwhile equipment, since you could feasibly find a really powerful weapon on your first island near the starting harbor and then spend the next 20 or 30 hours finding weapons that are perpetually worse than what you already have. And since the game is so pathetically easy, there isn't a compelling mechanical need to explore everywhere to earn all the glory and gold that you need to level up. It helps a lot early on, of course, but you can reach a point well before the end of the game when you've maximized your relevant stats and skills and thus have literally no more benefit to gain from exploring the remaining islands. Skull Island, which unlocks in Chapter 4 as the last thing you do before the final boss, has some of the best level design and gameplay mechanics of the entire game, but I for one had no motivation to explore it because there was no more rewarding incentive for me to do so that late in the game. If I'd been more assertive about building my character's stats earlier in the game, I probably would have reached that point even earlier, with yet more islands still yet to explore. The progression system is the same one carried over from Risen 2, where experience points don't go directly towards traditional level ups, but instead go into a generic pool of glory that you can spend in increasing amounts to increase your attributes, which increase your passive statistics for various types of actions you can take in the game, as well as serving as minimum requirements to learn special skills from trainers, which cost increasing amounts of gold to pay for. As with Risen 2, I like the system in theory for the strategic depth it offers, with having more nuanced decisions about how to spend your glory, since there are trade-offs between spreading your glory over several lower-level attributes that will give you some kind of immediate benefit, or stockpiling those points to put into a higher-level attribute that will yield some better reward at the expense of slowing down your progress in other areas. And with gold being so limited at the start of the game, and skills being so expensive, it really forces you to prioritize your character building in more specific ways, where it feels like there's a little more consequence to your decision making. Changing the attributes from only having 10 levels, like they were in Risen 2, to a full range of 100, in addition to making skills require combinations of different attributes instead of just one, helps a lot in fleshing the progression system out to make it feel a little more involved and a little more demanding than it was previously. It helps too that the different skill categories now feel more viably useful this time around. Crafting costs were completely nonsensical in Risen 2 and basically worthless, but now there's an incentive to learn weaponsmithing because you can upgrade many existing weapons for an extra boost to your damage, which is available exclusively through the crafting system. And the distilling skill is more viable as well now that the ingredient cost to make rum has been properly balanced, so it's cheaper to make your own versus buying it from a store, and it's also the only consistently reliable way to get painkillers which aren't sold in stores. The toughness attribute and its related defensive skills are likewise actually worth investing in now, at least as long as you're playing on ultra difficulty, which nerfs invincibility during roll dodges and prevents you from endlessly spamming healing items. And while there may be attributes that aren't really necessary for your chosen playstyle, you can't always treat them like a pure dump stat, because some other useful skill may require at least partial investment into it. You can circumvent this quite a bit, however, by brewing permanent stat potions, which will give you presumably up to 50 free attribute points per stat, so long as you can find all of the special ingredients needed to make permanent potions. The catch here is that you cannot use potions to improve your stats above the normal maximum that you can train to, and they also count against your progression in terms of future glory costs to improve your stats. Meaning they suffer the same problem as in Gothic 2 Night of the Raven, where you get punished for using them early, but you also don't get the benefit of using them late. And the game doesn't warn you about either one of these, by the way, so it's easy to get completely screwed if you're not conscious of testing the limits of everything before committing to anything, in which case you may end up wasting all of your potions for no effect, or needlessly forcing yourself to spend tens of thousands of extra glory leveling your stats than you really should. So that's pretty dumb, but it also means you only ever have to train your stats to around 50 or 60, halfway to max, considering you start with 10 and the maximum is 100, or 105 with the corresponding legendary item, before being able to finish the entire second half with potions. I haven't tested this, but that seems like it would make it really easy to max out every single stat in one playthrough, which is pretty ridiculous and probably shouldn't be happening in an RPG. Another hiccup here is that there are weird discrepancies between the attributes and skills window, where you have 8 attributes but only 6 skills, which collectively represent 10 different categories, since spirit, cunning, influence, and dexterity aren't directly represented on the skills tab, with other categories like hunting and thieving not being represented on the attributes tab. So when you're looking for a skill that increases a particular talent which falls under a particular attribute, it's sometimes a struggle to figure out what category you should be checking under, since some skills might logically fall under multiple categories, or might fall under a different category than the attribute that boosts that respective talent, or it might not even have a matching category at all. Compounding on this is that skill trainers teach unique combinations of skills, but are tracked on the map screen based on generic, non-inclusive categories. Something like the toughness category includes all kinds of things like physical defense, magic defense, intimidation, alcohol-related crafting and buffs, increasing your maximum health, and so on, which all might be taught by different trainers, but who are all generically labeled as toughness trainers on the map. So the whole skill system is sometimes just a confusing mess trying to find what you want due to the way everything is organized. The major new addition this time is Spirit, which serves as a partial requirement for some magic-related faction abilities, but is mostly used for enhancing your spirit vision, a sort of highlighting system that you can use to spot certain types of objects or living things more easily. This can be a handy tool for making sure you've sufficiently searched an area, but otherwise it's not very exciting, and easy to justify ignoring the skills to improve it altogether, since it's really not necessary at all if you're just diligent about looking around for yourself. There's also a new ability brought back from Risen 1 to make spell scrolls, but this likewise feels somewhat pointless to me because it only allows you to make single-use spell scrolls from infinite-use spells you've already learned from your chosen faction. The main benefit to this is that spell scrolls don't have cooldown restrictions, but apart from some minor annoyances with trying to cast a bunch of buffs or debuffs in a row at the start of a fight, I never really felt like the cooldowns were worth circumventing with spell scrolls, so I just never bothered with it. It seems to me like the skill would have been more alluring if it allowed you to make scrolls from the other faction's spells that you couldn't learn, which might have been worthwhile if it were harder to find or buy those scrolls through other means. Progression is not very exciting in general because there isn't a lot of evolution in the actual gameplay as you level up. Compared to previous games, there are generally fewer active gameplay-altering abilities to unlock, which makes it all feel much more stagnant. For the most part, your progression happens in just a few large chunks, usually when you start unlocking the more worthwhile general skills and then once you join a faction. Otherwise, the bulk of your progression happens by passively increasing your stats to deal more damage, which while effective in increasing your character's strength, is hard to really notice in practice because those boosts happen so gradually and in such small increments. When you join a faction, for example, you unlock a bunch of fun magic abilities, but then you spend the rest of the game passively boosting their damage instead of learning all new, more powerful versions of those spells that add new effects as you get stronger, like how they did with Gothic 2 with unlocking new tiers of fire projectiles that did progressively more damage, but also changed the visual effects while adding different combinations of area of effect or charging abilities. In Risen 3, you get your basic fireball spell, and that's it for the entire game. For melee combat, there are now only 3 unlockable skills that do anything beyond simply buffing your damage. One that allows you to perform counterattacks, one that increases your attack speed, and one that adds an extra hit to the combo, which can be unlocked at 40, 50, and 70 melee. Depending on how you build your character, those 2 skills at 40 and 50 might unlock around the same time, leaving you with only one more interesting skill to look forward to for the entire rest of the game. This is in contrast to how Risen 1 handled things, where your melee skill had 10 levels of progression, with each level unlocking some new active or passive ability to mix up the gameplay, and where increasing your strength had a more direct impact on your total damage, both in terms of the damage formula as well as in allowing you to equip stronger weapons. Armor progression is just straight up nonsensical, especially with the Adventurer's Garb DLC, which is basically given to you for free when you purchase the complete edition with the 2 DLC islands. With the Adventurer's Garb, you start the game with overpowered armor that's equivalent to your starting faction armor in basic defense, and then shortly after you join a faction you're given Morgan's set for free, which is even better than tier 1 faction armor. Then you rank up and get better faction armor, only to then get free heavy armor, which is even better. Then in Chapter 4 you get your max tier faction armor, and it's actually worse than the heavy armor. Meanwhile, there's no upgrading your trousers beyond the tier 1 faction set, and upgrading your boots only ever gives you a measly +1 to your defenses, which seems practically worthless. I don't know what the logic is behind any of these numbers or when you're given these armor sets, but the net effect was that I often just felt perplexed and disappointed by getting new armor sets that were either immediately worthless or were quickly rendered obsolete by something else I was then given for free. As I mentioned previously, the game is so ridiculously easy, even when playing on its hardest difficulty setting, that there's no real need to improve your character anyway, since you can defeat the toughest enemies in the game with absolutely zero combat training whatsoever. You're given a permanent companion character from the start of the game who helps a lot with tanking hits and redirecting enemies' attention away from you while also doing decent damage. Bones will even heal you during combat. And weapons don't have stat requirements to use, so you can do decent damage yourself just by getting lucky and finding a good weapon early in the game. When the game first launched, you even had full invincibility during the roll dodge, which you could continually spam since there was no stamina bar associated with it, and you could also spam healing items instantly with 0 animation time or cooldown, thus making you practically unbeatable. A whopping 6 months later, they patched in an ultra difficulty that completely removes invincibility during the roll dodge and adds a cooldown period to using healing potions. This helps the difficulty progression a lot by making it feel actually difficult to defeat endgame enemies at level 1 due to how much harder it is to survive, but it's still possible with enough skill and determination or the right use of special resources. The melee combat system is fundamentally the same thing as Risen 2's, except with a few tweaks that make it feel a lot better in practice. It helps a lot that you can dodge and block enemy attacks right from the beginning of Risen 3, seeing as those were completely absent in Risen 2 at launch and had to be patched in later, so it already feels better just being able to actually defend yourself properly this time around. They also changed the way attack animations work by making you time your mouse clicks in rhythm to produce faster combos, which play out in a 3-hit sequence of increasing damage for each subsequent attack, and by giving you a power attack right from the start, which you can charge to do variable amounts of extra damage depending on how long you hold the charge. The actual controls are more consistent too, as they no longer have so many overlapping functions on the same buttons, with counterattacks for example now being mapped to a single button instead of the convoluted 3-button sequence you had to execute in Risen 2. Counterattacks, by the way, also now work on all types of enemies as opposed to only sword-wielding humanoids. These changes make the combat feel more actively engaging with needing to execute more deliberate and precise inputs to fit certain attacks into specific windows of opportunity, with more of an emphasis on watching and learning the enemy's animations to know when to release a charge attack or initiate a counterattack. Compared to Risen 2, it feels like you have more actual control over what you're doing and that your inputs actually matter somewhat. Unfortunately, it is still the same core system from Risen 2, which means it carries over a lot of inherent problems and perhaps even introduces some new ones in the process. All of your attacks and blocks have perfect auto-tracking, where your character will automatically turn to target whatever enemy is most relevant to whatever action you're performing without requiring any input on your part to manage your phasing or to aim for specific targets. You can literally just stand still holding down the right mouse button and your character will block every single attack from every single enemy in every single direction. And if an enemy is frantically running around, you don't have to worry about tracking them with the camera and positioning your character correctly to land a hit, because you can just left click and he'll automatically turn and strike in the correct direction, even if the enemy is completely off screen. The game's continued use of the rubber band lock-on effect means you'll even automatically close distances to land the strike, up to a certain point. The game does so much of the work for you with these systems that it's hard to feel any real satisfaction from successfully landing hits or blocking attacks, because you just click or hold one button and watch as the game does everything else automatically, almost like you would in a more abstract point-and-click game, except without even needing to point. In a way, it actually feels like a shallow QuickTime event with the on-screen button prompts removed, masquerading as a combat system, because you often just rhythmically click the left mouse button and then right-click when you see an enemy about to attack. Other issues contribute towards making it actively frustrating at times. You can't manually lock onto a specific target, and just attacking the correct enemy you want is sometimes a hassle, since the auto-targeting system has a mind of its own and will sometimes target something completely different in the completely wrong direction, sometimes even targeting friendly NPCs over hostile enemies. Individual attack animations that you perform have variable lengths depending on where they fall in the combo and how far away you are from the enemy when starting an attack. This sometimes leads to your character performing unnecessarily long windups and fancy flourishes that leave you exposed to getting hit, when it would have made more sense to perform a much quicker animation instead. But you don't have direct control over the specific types of attack animations you do, so you're just at the mercy of the game deciding what types of animations it's going to use at what times. With enemies also using the distance closing rubber band targeting system, it makes it hard to know when you're safely out of an enemy's attack range, because any given attack might randomly have 10 feet of range. This is mainly a problem when playing on ultra difficulty, where the dodge doesn't give you any invulnerability during the animation, thus making you rely on it physically moving you out of the way of an attack to avoid damage, which sometimes feels pointless when enemies can just snap across the full distance you just dodged to hit you anyway. The dodge ability was ridiculously overpowered on the default difficulties, so it needed to be nerfed somehow, but the solution here just feels counterproductive given the other systems in play. The dodge nerf doesn't apply to enemies, by the way. They remain fully invincible while dodging, which is a little unfair, but I guess that's the point of playing on the hardest difficulty. Then there's the inconsistent sprinting that seems to be based on a hidden stamina bar or some other type of delay that randomly prevents you from sprinting, with no feedback system to understand why you can't sprint or even when the sprint key is going to be randomly unresponsive or become responsive again. Then we've got the forced double tap to dodge system that you can't disable, despite being able to bind dodge to its own separate button, which makes it really easy to accidentally dodge in unintended ways and sometimes inopportune directions, like when you just want to make micro adjustments to your positioning. And then there's the obnoxious hit stagger that completely interrupts whatever you are doing, sometimes in defiance of the laws of physics, leaving you in a long recoil period that sometimes even knocks you all the way to the ground. The effect of this is just straight up annoying, especially with how easy it is to get chain stunned by enemies whose attacks frequently seem to take priority over yours. The fact that it's so disruptive basically forces you into playing the game in an extremely defensive, reactive sort of way, where you have to react to every single enemy attack a certain way or else you'll be repeatedly punished. For example, if you get hit once, you have to immediately block, because anything else you do next will be interrupted by their guaranteed follow-up attack, and if you see an enemy charging a power attack, you have to do a quick attack to interrupt them because you won't be able to block it safely. If you have the counterattack ability, then of course you just right-click when you see them about to attack. If you're playing on any difficulty other than Ultra, then it doesn't matter either way because you just spam the roll dodge for every fight and you'll be literally invincible. This is where I think a lot of the game's annoyances come into play, because you often feel constrained to following a rigid script for the combat to have any sense of flow or responsiveness to it, and it's ultimately not a deep or robust enough system to allow for more creative, proactive options to working around enemy attacks, other than passively reacting to tells and doing the one most effective thing in each instance. So long as you buy into that script and play along with what the game practically demands from you, then it can be pretty smooth and enjoyable. But there are times when it feels like you shouldn't have to play along like that, like when you completely outclass a particular sort of enemy and feel like you should be able to just tank through their hits and win with pure offense. That's effectively what the ranged combat does, as it completely bypasses enemy defenses and allows you to win fights on pure offense. Ranged combat is effectively the same as it was in Risen 2, except now the cooldown period between shots has been drastically reduced and critical hits seem much more deterministic, thereby allowing you to steamroll enemies from a safe distance without having to deal with the sometimes frustrating melee combat. They even fixed the movement glitch that caused you to move forward while holding the back button after drawing your aim again during a reload. So ranged combat is far more effective than melee combat and works as a nice way to bypass the associated frustration with melee combat, but it's perhaps even less satisfying being so mindlessly easy with no need whatsoever for timed actions and reactions. Faction abilities are where the combat starts to shine, with you now once again being able to join one of 3 factions who will give you unique looking armor, unique rank promotion quests, and unique active abilities. The major innovation here is that all 3 factions have some form of magic abilities. As sort of general categories, the Guardians use more traditional elemental spells like Fireballs and Rain of Fire, with options for Ice and Lightning abilities. The Demon Hunters get various buffs to their physical offense and defense, and Voodoo Shamans get enemy debuffs and Necromancy. Most notably, each faction also gets a form of melee magic, which lets you cast short-range spells in front of you by left-clicking in rhythm like you would with a melee weapon, or switch to a ranged casting mode by holding right-click where you can aim and shoot projectiles. This is a fun addition, but it completely trivializes the already way too easy combat system when magic attacks work so much better than the regular melee system by working at a safer distance, hitting multiple enemies per hit, and bypassing enemies' defenses, while also allowing you to spam an infinite number of ranged projectiles that will kill most enemies before they can even get to you. All spells, except for the basic melee and ranged attack, work on a cooldown instead of pulling from a common pool of mana. This is a change I can get behind because it was always pretty tedious in previous games having to constantly stop to chug potions or munch on plants, and it was even worse running back and forth between beds to rest if you were trying to conserve your consumable items. So restricting your ability to spam more powerful spells by just putting them on a longer cooldown works as a good compromise. What I don't like is that every spell gets put in a few seconds of cooldown after every cast. I found this especially annoying when playing as a Demon Hunter, where I would often have to cast multiple buffs before fights, or when I was playing as a Voodoo Shaman and wanted to cast multiple debuffs on enemies at the start of a fight, both of which caused a lot of unnecessary waiting while drastically slowing down the action. So I'm not sure what the logic was in that, and I just wish they wouldn't have done that. The other weird thing is that the magic abilities between factions are somewhat symmetrical. They all have a unique stylistic flair, of course, but they each get their own version of a magic fist spell that can double as a ranged projectile, a damaging AoE radius spell, a telekinesis grab spell, a form of heal spell, 2 of them have summon ally spells, and 2 of them have a short-range knockback spell. With only 10 spells per faction, and some factions having multiple spell slots assigned to similar types of spells, like how Guardians get 3 magic fists or how the Demon Hunters get 2 different summons, it leaves each faction feeling like they really only have 3 or 4 truly unique spells, since everything else is just a reskinned version of another faction's spell with perhaps slightly different stats or mechanics applied to it. The heal spells are all technically different, for instance, since the Guardian heal works only on yourself, the Demon Hunter heal works in an area of effect and also heals allies, including your summons, and the Voodoo heal is based on stealing health from an enemy. The differences in that case are certainly appreciated, but at the end of the day it does limit some of the fun variety of replaying the game when it often feels like you're just experiencing another flavor of the same thing. Voodoo magic, fortunately, is much more fun and effective this time around than it was in Risen 2. It follows the same principle of dealing more so with enemy manipulation as opposed to direct offense, but you do at least get some ways to damage enemies this time. Between the melee fist spells called Swarm, the life-stealing Kiss of Death, Lingering Death which causes a slow dot on a single enemy, and Poison Cloud which confusingly isn't a dot as far as I can tell, but is instead just a flat AoE radius attack. Then, between Bloodlust and Necromancy, you can make enemies fight for you, which even allows you to have a small following of ghost allies for a limited time until their spirit runs out. That can make you feel rushed during exploration, however, since you can feel compelled to have to get to the next cluster of enemies before your summons run out, with needing to constantly keep a fresh supply of ghost allies lest you be bereft of that benefit for the next fight, and the extra allies can actually get in your way sometimes. Still, it can be pretty fun having your own little army, especially when you're able to resurrect some of the tougher enemies like golems or guardians. In practice, I didn't actually enjoy the voodoo spells as much as I'd hoped I would. Mainly, I just found it really tedious how many spells I had to cast at the start of every fight to make full use of the voodoo, which became dreadfully tedious with the annoying universal cooldown effect triggering between every single cast, but also it was just a major hassle anytime I wanted to target a specific enemy to debuff because you can't really target spells manually. It's similar to the melee system where the game just kind of automatically targets whatever happens to be closest to your current facing, which makes it really hard to cast on a specific target when there are multiple enemies close together, and also possible to miss altogether because the game decided you weren't actually targeting anything at all. It was especially frustrating anytime I tried to use the lifesteal spell to heal myself and found it firing off at nothing for no effect. In the end, I wound up preferring to shoot stuff with guns because it was ultimately a quicker and more consistently reliable way of killing enemies versus dealing with the slow cooldowns, bad targeting, and gimmicky status effects of most of their spells. The best thing about Voodoo is the Parrot transformation spell, since that allows for a ton of extra mobility during exploration, but you find tons of the single-use spell scrolls to use when playing as any other faction, so it doesn't really feel like a Voodoo exclusive ability. Oh, and a few of their quests do involve possessing other NPCs with voodoo dolls, which does lead to some fun interaction with other characters, so there's that at least. Guardians work better as pure mages, since their spells are more about dealing direct offense. Most notably, they get a passive skill that boosts their attack speed with melee fist spells, which makes their melee magic unequivocally superior to regular melee combat if it wasn't already. That, unfortunately, is kind of the whole extent of their repertoire when it comes to magic combat, with 30% of their spells being different elements of the same thing, which then requires you to switch elements depending on what enemies you're facing to take advantage of their resistances and weaknesses. They do get Wave of Energy for an AoE radius attack, Hail of Shards for an ice-based damaging knockback, and Rain of Fire for continuous damage over time in the area around you, but these fall off in usefulness pretty quickly. Hail of Shards has a relatively long cooldown time and doesn't do enough extra damage to justify its use when you can just maintain a faster DPS with your regular melee spells, and Rain of Fire scales its duration instead of its damage as your magic stat increases, which means it too winds up doing far less DPS than your basic melee spells. Wave of Energy is nice for basic crowd control if you start getting overwhelmed, but that's its primary use. Otherwise, they just get a worthless torch spell that you won't ever use because the game is perfectly bright at all times, everywhere, anyway, and a rust spell to break locks open instead of using your thievery skill. This is actually kinda nice just because it saves you the hassle of going through the lockpicking minigame, and it allows you to consolidate stat points into fewer disciplines since you don't need to dump points into dexterity to open locked chests. Demon Hunters specialize in utility buffs, with their unique spells increasing your melee attack speed, melee attack damage, and all of your defensive resistances. These buffs make them much more effective at melee combat than the other factions, but even with all the extra benefits, you're still stuck in the same old passive, reactive melee combat system where enemies can block and dodge attacks for 0 damage, and stagger you to high heaven with every minor attack, whereas the magic fist spells can completely bypass all of those hassles. I already didn't like the melee combat much in the first place, so I found it much more effective to just use the magic fists instead, which was effectively like being a worse version of a guardian since you don't get the attack speed boost for magic fists as a demon hunter. The Rune Skin spell is ridiculously overpowered whether you're a demon hunter or another faction using a spell scroll, since it can make you literally invulnerable to all damage in a game that's already way too easy to begin with. Otherwise, Stone Fist and Shockwave are copies of other Guardian spells, leaving the two summon abilities as their only other unique spells. And needless to say, that's not particularly exciting gameplay to just have another allied NPC or two following you around acting under their own AI. Your dodge ability does passively turn into a teleport effect, but I'm not sure this actually changes the mechanics of your dodge since it seems to travel the same distance and you can still take damage while invisible or dematerialized or whatever. So I think it's mostly just a cosmetic effect and not any real benefit to being a demon hunter. So the factions are definitely not perfect, as I feel they could have each had a little more work put into their abilities to make them feel more uniquely differentiated, with a stronger feeling of progression as you leveled up your faction abilities, but it does go a long way towards restoring some of that Piranha Bytes charm that was missing in Risen 2 and allowing you to actually join a faction this time, and it also helps with the progression just a tiny bit by locking certain faction abilities behind quest progression, since you can't just learn all of their abilities at once as soon as you join. DLC for Risen 3 includes 2 new islands with their own sort of main questline and the previously mentioned Adventurer's Garb that gives you a better set of armor after you finish the Crab Coast. I'm not a big fan of the Adventurer's Garb because 1, I think it looks pretty goofy, 2, it's just a reskin of Morgan's set which you get later in the game anyway, so it's not even that unique, and 3, it's completely overpowered having what is essentially Tier 1 faction armor for free from the very start of the game. You have the option not to use it, but it's included in the Complete Edition, which is ultimately the cheapest way to get the 2 extra islands, so since you're going to end up with it anyway, the temptation is pretty strong to just use it. To me, it would have made more sense for the DLC armor to be just slightly better than your default starting armor to give you a little bit of a boost at the start of the game, but from a business perspective, that makes it seem less valuable and less enticing, so I do understand wanting to make it feel like a more worthwhile purchase. The 2 new islands, on the other hand, offer some of the most fun and unique scenarios of the entire game, which helps to justify the extra cost, even though I really don't like the concept of launch DLC as it feels like a manipulative way to artificially inflate the game's price. Regardless, Fog Island is fairly large and tasks you with helping Carlos and Venturo, your Inquisition friends from Risen 2 who've come to explore the mysterious island for the first time, in aiding the soldiers who've scattered around the map. The island itself has a strong theme and tone, with a weird sense of things not being what they seem and everyone going slightly mad, as if there's some kind of sinister force pervading the island. The actual quest mechanics are no more sophisticated than the ones in the base game, but they provide a much more compelling narrative context for what's going on, with more interesting story scenarios and character interactions. I was actually rather engaged by some of the quests on this island and really appreciated the eerie atmosphere they created. And of course, some of them are just plain simple fun.
Why? What's up with the ducks?
Ducks. They aren't ducks. They are servants of death, my friend.
What the fuck?
The map itself is fairly large too, so there's a decent amount of content to justify its value. The Uprising of the Little Guys DLC sends you back to the Thieves' Isle from Risen 2, where the gnomes' homeland has been invaded by goblins. Your goal on this island is to infiltrate each of the goblin camps without being detected, to retrieve the stolen ancestral spirits Orikolki, and then defeat the goblin boss to restore peace and safety to the island. The emphasis here is stealth, since attacking the goblins or getting caught could cause harm to the ancestral spirit, so you need to scout out the environments and find a safe way to get past the goblins' defenses, which might mean swimming around to an unguarded beachfront, or climbing over rocks to drop in from above, or getting up to the edge of a barricade and sending a pet monkey through. The stealth mechanics are obviously fairly crude given that this is an RPG with a sneak skill and not a proper stealth game, but it's still fun to see these more creative scenarios where you can approach each objective in a different way depending on how you've built your character or how you choose to navigate the environments. I certainly found it much more engaging than so many of the basic filler quests that are littered throughout the base game. Although I do wish they hadn't resorted to pasting red flags across the map to specifically telegraph the safe routes to each camp, as I would much rather have had the satisfaction of figuring those routes out for myself rather than just following the dotted line, essentially. The quest design kind of falls apart, however, if you don't explicitly play along with the story implications or the intended gameplay solutions. There's supposed to be some great risk of permanently losing the ancestral spirits if you aggro the goblins, but in reality you can just sprint through the camp, grab the Orikolki, sprint away, and everything will be perfectly fine. Even if you play along with not aggroing the goblins, you can transform into a parrot to completely scout out a safe path into the heart of the camp in advance with zero risk of ever getting caught. You can even walk up to within plain eyesight of the goblins, pull a pet monkey out of your pocket, and send it right into the camp where you can grab the Orikolki and go right back to your character with zero issues. It's pretty disappointing how easy it is to break the central quest design of this DLC, but at least it's a unique gameplay scenario that you don't really get to do in the base game, and it can be decently enjoyable if you play along with the intended solutions. Most of Risen 3 could be summarized simply as being better than Risen 2, but not as good as some of Piranha Bytes' previous games. That's perhaps not a shocking verdict, given that it would be hard to be worse than Risen 2, while Gothic 1 and 2, and to a lesser extent Risen 1, were lightning in a bottle. So being worse than Gothic or Risen 1 is no damning criticism, but by the same token being better than Risen 2 is not an impressive accomplishment. When examined on an individual basis, most of its features are at least decent and functional, which is more than can be said of some of their previous games, and it's nice to see them take the feedback from Risen 2 and actually make a concerted effort to correct their mistakes. The fact that they were actively trying to go back to their roots and provide a more Gothic-like experience is also very much appreciated, even though their attempts feel a little hollow and thus don't hit their mark. The major problem I have is that the game as a whole doesn't feel like much of an evolution on their previous game design. It's largely derivative of the same things we've already seen and done before, but still not as good. By that point in their history, I think the formula was beginning to have diminishing returns, as it was becoming more and more clear that they were never going to capture the magic again with any subsequent games, while continued attempts to just put out the same game over and over again was starting to grow wearisome. It wasn't until Elix a few years later that I felt like they injected some much needed innovation with things like the jetpack, expanded role-playing systems with skill checks and dialogue, and more meaningful impacts from the karma system, in combination with the radical blending of different themes and settings, and all of the unique world building and backstory. In that sense, Risen 3 actually feels kind of like a bland prototype for what Elix would eventually become, with certain elements that were only half-baked in Risen 3 having their potential tapped far better in Elix. But of course, at the time, it was basically just a better version of Risen 2, which if you didn't like Risen 2, made it kind of hard to like Risen 3. In the context of its original release in 2014, Risen 3 is what I would consider good enough for a Piranha Bytes game in the sense that there is at least a fundamental level of satisfaction in the overall experience to be had if you can buy into everything it's selling and accept the fact that it's not going to achieve the magical heights of the early Gothic games or the heart of the experience as well as Risen 1. However, the quality level is stretched a little too thin over the full game experience without enough truly unique or exciting content or a satisfying feeling of progression to keep things interesting the whole way through. It doesn't help matters that the combat difficulty is so pathetically easy that you can defeat end-game main quest bosses with zero combat training, and that the bulk of the game's content is front-loaded in what is effectively the first chapter. So even with some degree of buy-in and acceptance, getting through the game can still feel a bit like a tedious chore, like you're just going down the checklist of things to do until each island is complete and until the game is eventually over. And that's a shame, because there was good potential for this to be one of their better games with a few simple tweaks to the mechanics, more challenging difficulty, a more developed story, and better structuring of its world design and main quest. As it is, it's not really remarkable in any way other than being somewhat competent, which is I guess all it really needed to be after Risen 2. But it is just a little bit disappointing that it never really aspires to be any more than serviceable at best.